Hello everybody, this is your Digital Super Saiyan 3 back with another video, getting ready to do my October pay-per-view review for my retro pay-per-view review series. Today, I'm doing WCW Halloween Havoc 1998. Took place October 25th, 1998 at the MGM Grand Hotel. On commentary, we got Tony Schiavone, Bobby the Brain Heenan, and the Professor, Mike Tenay, baby. This is the second time I'm reviewing a WCW pay-per-view, because back in June I did my review of WCW Great American Bash 1997. This time I'm doing Halloween Havoc 98. And, well, this show is known for having the rematch from WrestleMania 6 that was atrocious. That was an atrocious match between Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior. But we will get into that when we get into that. We kick off the show for our opening match we got for the WCW Television Championship as the champion Chris Jericho takes on Raven in a solid opening match. Now, Raven and Jericho, this was just like them going from the flow. It's like going with the flow kind of thing, but this was a solid match between Jericho and Raven. I gotta say, Raven, yes, he was a very underrated wrestler, and, Jericho, he's still around. Jericho's still, he's still doing his thing. Right now, he's on the indies and doing the whole Alpha Club thing. I mean, the master of reinventing himself. Chris Jericho is, doing that. He's doing his thing. Next up on the show, we get a match between Ming and Raph. This match should have just taken place on Nitro. Ming and Raph, this match wasn't, it just feels like this match should have just been on Nitro or Thunder or any other WCW show. Wrath gets the victory, nothing more to be said. And yes, I know I forgot to talk about who wins the match between Jericho and Raven, but Jericho won via submission. But Wrath, though, like I said, with the match between Wrath and Ming, it just feels like this match should have just happened on Nitro or Thunder or even Saturday night. Next up on the show, we get Juventud Guerrera taking on Disco Inferno, and the winner of this match between Juventud Guerrera and Disco Inferno goes on to face the champion Billy Kidman for the cruiserweight. Goes on to face the cruiserweight champion Billy Kidman later on in the night, and this was a solid outing by Disco Inferno. This would probably be the best Disco Inferno match I've seen since Bash at the Beach 96 with his match with Dean Malenko. Since the Dean Malenko match from Bash at the Beach 1996. I mean, granted, I wasn't a big fan of Disco Inferno since going back on the WWE Network and watching some of this WCW stuff, but I wouldn't say Disco is bad by any means. He does have a good outing on this show by having to pull double duty, and Disco gets the victory in his match with Juventud. Next up, though, this is another match I feel like should have just been on Nitro or Thunder, but Alex Wright defeating Fit Finlay. Now, I wouldn't say Fit Finlay is bad by any means, and in fact, Fit Finlay was a very underrated talent, like William Regal. But I feel like Fit Finlay and Alex Wright just had just this match that should have just been on Nitro or Thunder. That's what some of this card feels like with Halloween Havoc 98. It just feels like some of these matches feel like they should have been on Nitro or Thunder or even Saturday night for WCW. But that's I don't know. I don't know what to make of this match, but next up but Alex Wright gets the victory. Nothing more to be said here. Next up we got Perry Saturn or in this case, just Saturn, defeating Lodi in a squash match. This was just a squash match between Saturn and Lodi. Really not that good of a match. It just feels like again, this match should have just happened on Nitro or Thunder and not on the pay-per-view. But of course, it's then followed up by the Disco Inferno again coming out, as Disco Inferno takes on the champion Billy Kidman for the Cruiserweight Championship in a very good match. And again, another solid outing by the Disco Inferno. On this night, I gotta respect the Disco Inferno for this double duty performance that he was willing to do. I mean, first, earlier on in the night, beating Juventud Guerrera, then going up against the champion Billy Kidman. He takes the fight to Kidman in this match, but ultimately Billy Kidman retains the Cruiserweight Championship and is still the WCW Cruiserweight Champion. Next up on the show, we get a tag team match for the WCW Tag Team Championships, as Scott Steiner and the Giant take on Rick Steiner and Buff Bagwell. Now, originally, before the Jericho and Raven match, Buff Bagwell and Rick Steiner had an interview with Mean Gene Okerlund. And basically, Buff talked about how he was going to be in Rick Steiner's corner for his match with Scott Steiner. Then a few moments later, after a few matches, Steiner talked about how that he and the Giant would put the WCW Tag Team Championships on the line, and if Rick Steiner and Buff Bagwell beat them, then Scott Steiner would have a match afterwards with Rick Steiner, basically because he had been running from Rick Steiner for months. Yeah, that steroidal bleach blonde bastard kept running from his brother. Alright, so now we get to the match at hand. And now we get to the match. So, on this night, the dog-faced gremlin Rick Steiner was on a roll. He overcomes the odds, even when Buff Bagwell, during the tag team title match, turns his back on Rick Steiner to lure Rick Steiner into a false sense of security. Buff Bagwell turned his back on Rick Steiner. However, Rick Steiner overcomes the odds, taking out the Giant, Scott Steiner, and Buff Bagwell to become the WCW Tag Team Championships. Now the question was, who was he going to be the Tag Team Champion with? Well, it's no secret that this leads up to the whole Judy Bagwell becoming a Tag Team Champion thing, because Rick Steiner partners up with Buff Bagwell's mom, Judge Judy. Or Judy Bagwell, if you will. And yeah, next we got the grudge match, brother versus brother, as Rick Steiner yet again takes on his brother Scott Steiner. And of course, Scott Steiner, who turned his back on his brother back at Super Brawl 98, joined the NWO. He's part of NWO Hollywood, the NWO Black and White, because in 1998, the NWO split into two rivaling factions, NWO Hollywood and NWO Wolfpack. NWO Hollywood wore the traditional NWO Black and White, while NWO Wolfpack wore black and red. But on this night, Rick Steiner was practically Superman on this night. The one time on a WCW pay-per-view you literally see Rick Steiner defy the odds. And yeah, Rick Steiner defeated Scott Steiner. So in two back-to-back matches, Rick Steiner won. So yeah. So on this night, I also respect Rick Steiner for doing this whole thing. Next up, we get the grudge match that everybody had been waiting for. Scott Hall versus Kevin Nash. NWO founding member versus NWO founding member. Scott Hall turned his back on Kevin Nash at Slamboree 1998 during a WCW Tag Team title match in the main event of Slamboree 98 when they defended their titles against Sting and the Giant. And Sting, during that match, after that match, had to decide which side he would be on. Team NWO Hollywood or Team Wolfpack. And you know Sting chose the NWO Wolfpack, and then he had a match with the Giant at the Great American Bash 1998 in the main event to determine who will hold on to the tag team belts. And Sting won that match, and the NWO Wolfpack held on to those belts. Then the NWO Wolfpack held on to those belts, and then the NWO Hollywood won those belts off of them, and you know what I mean. But Scott Hall and Kevin Nash had a really solid match here. It's a really solid match between Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. As, you know, this was during a time period where Scott Hall's alcoholism was really bugging him, and, you know, Scott Hall was... And WCW turned this, like, instead of getting Scott Hall help for his thing, they just treated it like a storyline, like really, they just took advantage of Scott Hall's alcoholism. Wow, WCW, and you couldn't decide to get him help? Anyway, Nash and Hall have a really good match here, a really solid back and forth, and Nash delivered 2 jackknife powerbombs to Hall. Scott Hall took the countout victory when Kevin Nash walked out of the ring, refusing to pin Scott Hall. So basically, Scott Hall won the match via countout because Nash didn't want to pin Hall after those 2 jackknife powerbombs, but it was still a solid match. Next up, we get Wolfpack Sting taking on NWO Hollywood's Bret Hart. Yes, that's right, Bret Hart, who was a heel in WCW, especially in 1998, joined the NWO Hollywood, and he is now the U.S. champion. And Bret Hart's time in the U.S. And Bret Hart, his time in WCW wasn't all that great or all that was cracked up to be. I mean, sure, Bret Hart did win the U.S. title multiple times, but at least he did better than Jim Neidhart and Bulldog when they were in WCW with him. Still, Bret Hart's time in WCW wasn't all that was cracked up to be. And he has a really solid match with the Wolfpack Sting. Sting no longer wearing the black and white, he's wearing the black and red of the Wolfpack. And he came out wrestling having a goatee on his face. And yes, Sting grew a goatee during this time period of 98. It was a solid match between Sting and Bret Hart. Where Sting then knocked himself out after overextending himself with a stinger splash into the corner. The referee was knocked out, and Bret Hart, he was wailing away on Sting. He beat Sting with a baseball bat and then locked the sharpshooter into Sting. Then when the referee came to, he saw Bret Hart holding the sharpshooter onto Sting. And, well, Bret Hart won via KO because Sting was out and couldn't tap out to the sharpshooter. And so Bret Hart is still the U.S. champion. Next up we get in one of the most dumbest matches in all of professional wrestling history. The absolute worst match that came out of this show, that made this show so infamous, is Hollywood Hulk Hogan defeating the Ultimate Warrior. And this match was a total piece of crap. This rematch should have happened back in 1991, not late 1998. And Warrior basically knew why he was brought to WCW. Warrior was brought to WCW just so Hulk Hogan could get his win back from WrestleMania 6. Unfair. fucking believable that this match sucked. No wonder why this match sucked. It was slow, it was dull, it was boring, and of course you had Horace Hogan coming in, being the reason why Hulk Hogan won this match, and it was so stupid. This was the NWO definitely at its worst, and Hollywood Hulk Hogan at his worst. And yeah, they tried to set the Warrior on fire, and people stopped them. It was just awful. And this led the cable company back in 1998 to cut the feeds to the show before a good main event could happen. More or less because the cable company basically reacted to watching this dumbass match. But thanks to the WWE Network, you can watch this entire show in its entirety, and basically you can still watch the main event. And speaking of the main event, it definitely follows up very well. And it's a good-ass main event, as Goldberg defeats Diamond Dallas Page to retain the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. And this is said to be Goldberg's best match, and not gonna lie, this match was really good between Diamond Dallas Page and Goldberg. DDP that night took the fight to Goldberg, as DDP at Fall Brawl 98 during the War Games match, for some reason, basically got his opportunity at the title. And it was a good way. I mean, this match made both men look good, but in the end, Goldberg still remained undefeated until Starrcade 98. Final thoughts with Halloween Havoc 1998. This show really left me divided. I can't say if it's good or bad. I mean, okay, the worst thing that came out of this show was the Hogan and Warrior rematch. But the best things on the show, like the double duty performance by Disco Inferno and Rick Steiner, and heck, even the Sting and Bret Hart match was good for what it was. Sure, it could have been done a little bit better with both men being baby faces, but, it was 1998. And Nash and Hall was good for what it was. It was still a solid match, though. But there were some things about this show that just made me feel like some of these matches on the card of this show felt like they could have taken place on Nitro or Thunder. Heck, Chris Jericho and Raven was good for what it was. But yeah, some of these matches felt like they weren't needed on this show, and Hogan and Warrior was also the worst thing to happen, and still remains one of the worst matches in professional wrestling history. This has been your Digital Super Saiyan 3, and I'll see you next time. And in 2019, I plan to do more WCW shows.